Okay. Good evening again, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this informational community session for the Zero Emission Passenger Rail and Trail Project, also called ZEPRT for short. My name is Tiffany Mendoza, and I'll be moderating tonight's meeting. Before we dive into the presentation, I will go over a few Zoom logistics details. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the project website, along with the recordings of the 4 prior information sessions, which are currently available on the Santa Cruz RTC's website. Tonight's meeting is being hosted in both English and Spanish. In a few minutes, we will open the Spanish audio channel. To access the audio channels, you will click the interpretation button, which will show as a globe icon in the Zoom taskbar. When you click on that, a menu will appear and you can select your preferred language. At this time, I will pause so that this message can be repeated in Spanish. And at that point, when that concludes, we will open up those audio channels.
Sí, muy buenas.
Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you. Sí, buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a tener interpretación al español. En un momento se va a activar la función de la interpretación simultánea. Busquen por favor en sus pantallas, en la parte baja o alta de su pantalla, un símbolo de un mundo terráqueo que dice interpretación. Por favor, haga clic ahí y seleccione el idioma que prefiere. En este caso sería español. Para solamente escuchar a la interpretación y no al audio original, haga clic donde dice Mute Original Audio o silenciar el audio original. Si está en un teléfono celular o cualquier otro dispositivo móvil, busque 3 puntitos, ya sea en la parte superior o inferior de su pantalla, que dice More o más, y seleccione bajo interpretación el idioma español. También no se olviden de hacer clic en donde dice Done para activar la función. Muchas gracias. Ya estamos a sus órdenes. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. At this time, we will open those audio channels. So we invite participants to select your audio channel by clicking that interpretation button. And we do ask all participants and panelists to choose a language. So also if you speak English, we also ask that you click that interpretation button and select English. Closed captioning is also available tonight. If you'd like to use this option, you can click the CC icon in the Zoom taskbar and select subtitles to view that on the screen, or you can select live transcript to see the full transcript on the side panel. And if you need technical support this evening, you can click on the Q&A button and describe the issue you're having there, and our team will help you as best we can. Also, this evening's format will include a presentation followed by a question and answer session. To ask a question, you can click the Q&A button in the meeting taskbar and type your question. We do encourage everyone to enter your questions throughout the presentation, and we will address as many questions as we can get through at the end of the presentation. For anyone participating in person in the RTC conference room, you can write your questions on the paper provided and hand them to an RTC staff person, and they will submit the questions on your behalf. And at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Riley Gerbrandt, who is the project manager with the Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. And welcome again, everybody, to our information session number 5 for the Zero Emission Passenger Rail and Trail Project. To begin tonight's webinar, we will do a brief project overview of the project, as well as some of the recent key actions and project developments before getting into the content for today's webinar. Next slide. And so when after the brief overview of the project, and the recent developments. We will get into the content of the webinar, which is going to be updates on the conceptual rail and trail alignment and operations that will support passenger rail service. And we will touch on items including preliminary travel times, station locations, conceptual alignment updates, and rail vehicle updates. And as Tiffany mentioned in the preview for this evening's webinar, we do have a Q&A session for community questions and inputs at the end of the webinar today. We do ask that if you have a question that you know that you do want to ask, please go ahead and pop that into the Q&A as soon as you can. That way we can start populating the questions for our Q&A session so that we're ready to go and can get those questions lined up and answered. Next slide. So as I mentioned, first we'll do a brief project overview for those of you who've been here before and seen the overview. It's similar to what we've talked about before. The Zero Emission Passenger Rail and Trail project aims to deliver new high capacity passenger rail service and stations on approximately 22 miles of the Santa Cruz Branch Rail Line from Pajaro in northern Monterey County to Santa Cruz in Central County or North County, as well as 12 new miles of the Coastal Rail Trail segments 13 through 20, as well as segment 11 phase 2, which is the Capitola Trestle Reach. And on your screen there is a project study area showing the alignment and study area of the passenger rail service in dark blue and the Coastal Rail Trail new segments in green with the dashed line. Next slide. So far, we have completed 3 of the project milestones, and we're approaching milestone number 4, which is the draft concept report and preliminary cost estimates and next steps from project development. We have pushed out the milestone 4 to have the main components complete in summer of 2025 and the final concept report adopted in the fall of 2025. Next slide. And we wanted to start off tonight's webinar with a brief review of some of the key actions that have happened recently. So one of the key actions that the project team and the commission has taken in recent months has been looking at the project funding outlook. And in the March 20th presentation and item at the RTC Commission meeting, there was a commission action to align the zero emission passenger rail and trail project with the state rail plan, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But funding for a capital project like the zero emission passenger rail project involves a combination of federal, state, and local funding sources. And generally, a project like this, almost to a T, will require multiple funding sources to be able to complete the environmental analysis, preliminary engineering, right-of-way, final engineering and construction, as well as fund the operations and maintenance of the project once complete. And the project funding outlook has changed considerably at the state and federal levels since the project commenced in 2022. The 2 key things that have changed since then are the implementation of the Federal Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, or the IIJA, as well as the adoption of the California State Rail Plan in January 2025. And also recently, the uncertainty of the new administration, federal investment policies and priorities. Next slide. So traditionally, a project such as zero emission passenger rail and trail project has the pre-construction activities funded locally. with or in a combination of state and local funding. What has changed is the implementation, as I mentioned, of the IIJA, the Infrastructure Jobs Act, and implementing the Federal Railroad Administration's Corridor Identification and Development Program, or the Corridor ID program. And that program specifically was designed to create a pipeline of intercity rail projects to develop and deliver throughout the United States. Another program that rail projects will often go to and have historically are the Federal Transit Administration's projects for commuter rail and light rail projects. The key difference between the two of them are under the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA's programs, the pre-construction activities are funded locally, and the capital investment comes when you're going to the construction phase of the project. And generally, they have a maximum of about 50% for the federal investment. And that would require a local and state match of the other remaining 50%. But through the Corridor ID program underneath the Federal Railroad Administration, that new program actually does federal grants for the pre-construction activities, with federal grants offering up to 80% maximum contribution for some of the pre-construction and environmental documentation phases. So on March 20th, the RTC Commission took the action to align the passenger rail service plan on the Santa Cruz Branch rail line with the state rail plan in order to maximize funding eligibility and technical support through the state and federal programs. As we've been working closely with the state and Caltrans, who's the lead for the service development plan on the Central Coast Corridor, which includes the Santa Cruz Branch rail line. We've learned that the state is also implementing and prioritizing projects that leverage those federal dollars, particularly through the Corridor ID program. And that is a summary of the funding outlook for the project and recent actions by the Commission. And we'll move to the next slide. So before we move on from the concept of intercity rail, it's important to establish what intercity rail is, or some of the give some background and parameters on it. So the authorizing legislation, which authorized Amtrak, distinguished between commuter and intercity rail service, but it wasn't particularly clear on what the definition of that intercity rail definition is being. So it laid out what commuter rail is, and on the screen here is the commuter rail definition. And bear with me a moment. Okay, so this definition talks about commuter rail, talks about intercity rail being passenger rail. That doesn't include commuter rail. But the definition basically excludes services that are short distance commuter rail trains within one city area, or slow regional trains that are stopping at all frequent stations and covering local journeys only. In contrast, an intercity rail train is typically an express train with limited stops and comfortable carriages that serve longer distance travel. And next slide will provide a little bit more information on intercity rail service. So intercity rail is not just peak hour service, but service that provides regular service between cities, not at the local level that light rail provides. So for what it looks like in Santa Cruz County, let's boil it down to that. So the key difference from light rail to intercity is mainly the frequency of those stations and the frequency of stopping at different stations covering the service area. So with intercity rail service, we're looking at on the order of maybe 6 to 8 stations on the Santa Cruz branch rail line, and having that service integrate with service that would be on the Union Pacific main line on the Central Coast Corridor. Whereas with a light rail service, you'd have more frequent stops. What we would look to be doing through, and we'll talk about it later in this presentation when I think Mark McLaren from the project manager HDR is going to touch on it, but our service would be focused on those main intercity rail stations, and then we wouldn't be stopping at all of the more frequent stations that we might have, like express or exception stops that would be seasonal or other type of service stations. Next slide. Okay, and then what we've been doing since Milestone 3, in addition to the Commission's actions to align the passenger rail service development with the state rail plan by implementing intercity rail on the branch line, we've been continuing to progress the project activities. In Milestone 3, we heard feedback that identified quite a few topics that needed, or several topics that needed further study and engineering analysis and work. Those included the considerations for the Pajaro River Bridge in relation to current work and development of the Army Flood Control Project in Watsonville and Pajaro, as well as operations and access to properties related to the Walker Street Acgrade rail alignment in Watsonville, improvements in areas that are susceptible to sea level rise and coastal rail trail alignment work, particularly trail connections to community resources and existing trail networks. Also, Aptos Village area bridge replacements, which we'll talk a little bit more about in subsequent slides tonight, and the alignment of the rail facility both near Highway 1 and the Carrillo College area and in front of the boardwalk along Beach Street in Santa Cruz. Next slide. All right, and with that, I will hand it over to HDR project manager Mark McLaren to dive a little bit deeper onto the continued work that we've been doing.
Thanks, Riley. Next slide, please, Tiffany. Okay, so as Riley mentioned, there was a conversation and has been the discussion about aligning this project and confirming that it aligns with the state rail plan and specifically the opportunities for funding through the FRA's corridor ID program with an emphasis on intercity rail. And as we talked many times, we've been out in the community and the opportunities that we've had through the open houses and the review of this project over time. The real couple of things are differentiators of intercity service when compared to some more frequent local service or light rail service is one of the options that had come out of previous work and had been looked at in this corridor. And those are all things that are focused on the idea that the service is here not only to serve the local community and provide connections between Watsonville and Santa Cruz, but also connecting and having the ability to interline in the future with the main line through Pajaro and provide connections from Santa Cruz, say on a one-seat ride to other cities in the region outside or beyond Watsonville by the train continuing on to those alignments. And these are important considerations because in the FRA's evaluation of a project and going through it, there are different things that they're looking at as well, too, to understand the operation and the cost of a project a little differently from what the Federal Transit Administration doing in something that's running much more frequently throughout the day with more stops along the corridor. So in the discussion tonight, what we'd like to talk to you about is some of the characteristics of the project that are being evaluated to demonstrate how it would align with the intercity program and that funding eligibility. And then we're also going to talk about where we are with the alignment based on a lot of the input that we've heard from many of you through the last couple milestones of public engagement and the work that's underway currently to resolve and address some of the areas where we have some conflicts and some things that have to be resolved with community support for the definition of the project. So I'm going to start that conversation this evening with potential station locations. So this is an exhibit that we have talked about previously as a part of our public meetings in terms of station locations that were identified as a part of the previous work that had been evaluated, as well as some interest that came from public conversation about other locations where there might be an interest in having stations that might not be serving daily needs in terms of travel through the corridor, but serving locations like such as some of the beach access areas that would be seasonal or during, say, weekend or other times of the year that aren't traditional travel times for people, say, going to work or using it to go to school and other opportunities. So this is the list that we started that conversation with. If you could go to the next slide, Tiffany. In the conversation of these stations as we look at intercity service, we're focused, as we've talked before, on understanding ridership by the various station locations in terms of the stations that are going to provide useful utility to the system and attract riders to it. We're also looking at the rail operations and the safety of those locations and what's served, as well as the access to those sites, be it for local residents who can walk or bicycle to a station or use local bus service to connect and or park and ride or get dropped off at a station by another mode. And these are all important considerations in addition to just the engineering feasibility of those sites and what the adjacent uses are, because it's all these pieces of the puzzle that determine the usefulness of a station to people in the area, and a station being accessible, being safe, and those sorts of things are an important consideration that people make in their decision to ride the train, say, as opposed to driving or taking another mode for their travel in the area. Next slide, please. So as we've gone through this conversation and we've been updating data in the regional travel model to look at the characteristics of the various station locations for ridership and understanding the changes that have occurred in travel volumes, as well as visitor activity and regular travel for work and school and those sorts of things in the model. We've gone through and prioritized the stations to a list that we believe is the appropriate starting point for evaluating the trade-offs in the various station locations and fine-tuning this list to a list that's reasonably sized for the length of the system. The stops are frequent enough to serve important areas and connections for people to get on and off the system, depending on where they want to travel within Santa Cruz County or outside, but not being so frequent that it slows down the travel time, because the travel time along a corridor like this is ultimately one of the biggest considerations that people make, and the reliability of that travel time in terms of how they're going to choose to travel from one area to another. And as we've gone through this and looked at it, we looked at these station locations from two different perspectives. One is looking at what traditional modeling data tells us about travel within the corridor, where people are going, what time of day they're traveling, and those sorts of things, and what the purpose of their trip is. And from that, we've identified what you see in the middle column here, which is a high, medium, low in a qualitative assessment of those stations based on the data that we have in terms of their propensity for attracting and having strong ridership as a part of the project. The second column is a column where we did a little different analysis, because what we looked at is the other types of activities that are in this area that are not traditional generators from a travel model perspective of what we would call commuter trips or worker school trips. But they're the trips that would occur as a result of the number of special activities and the tourism that occurs within Watsonville and Santa Cruz. So, for example, in the area of the boardwalk in that area had 3 million visitors last year. That's a substantial number. And so those numbers get evaluated a little differently within a model than we look at work and school trips that are regular daily trips that are being taken by the same people typically day in and day out. And we evaluated both of those and ranked them again high, medium, and low in terms of their propensity for attracting riders in those areas. So with that, we have taken the list of stations and identified what we believe would be the 7 reasonable stops between Watsonville as one end of the line and Santa Cruz at the other, with a distribution based on our understanding of the land use, the connectivity to those stations, the other things we talked about on the previous slide, as well as the propensity for attracting riders. And that's what's represented in this table here. Understanding that, for example, in Santa Cruz, is we look at 2 different alternatives for the end of the line, one being the historic depot, the other one being natural bridges. We wouldn't have both of those stations, but as we look at testing alternatives, either one of those would be considered at the end of the line in that location. At the other end of the line in Watsonville, we would be looking at the end of the line being essentially Pajaro Station. Again, in the future, it's with the intent that a train could continue beyond there. But one of the things that we don't have a lot of data on yet at this point is information from other sources about what the forecasts are for opportunities for connection in Pajaro Station to connect to other elements of the state rail plan, and that's part of the consideration. So this is the list of stations that we've identified as the starting point, and we're doing the ridership evaluation on, with the understanding that how each of these stations fare may help us determine stations that we might add or that we might shift or change to a different location to serve that area, depending on what the model tells us about the connectivity and the benefits of those locations in the system. If you could go to the next slide, please. So a key part of this, as I mentioned, is really understanding the travel times, and the end-to-end time is what we take into consideration. And when we look at this evaluation, if you think about this comparing to if you were to drive yourself or take another mode, and how during the times of the day that trip can vary considerably depending on the amount of traffic and the direction that you're going and what your ultimate destination is. The advantage that the train provides is the ability to have a reliable travel time throughout the day. And so we want to make sure that that time is competitive with the other options that you would have. When we look at the line today from Watsonville or Pajaro Station to Santa Cruz to Natural Bridges, and we look at the list of stations that I just reviewed as that initial list of the stations that demonstrate good propensity for ridership along the line. We've evaluated and looked at this from the perspective of timing, that it would take 40 to 45 minutes for a train to make that entire trip from Pajaro to Natural Bridges and to make those stops along the way. The stops are an important part of this conversation because each time we add a stop to the line or we take one out, it has the impact of about 2 minutes on travel time. So if we were to take the number of stations that we have identified right now on the previous list, and we were to just say double that number, that could add another 20 minutes to the travel. And if you have the choice to drive or other ways to travel, and you looked at this trip, you might look at the trip differently in terms of an alternative or a desirable alternative if you know the trip is going to take you 60 minutes versus take you an hour. And I'm sorry, 40 minutes. So 60 minutes versus 40 minutes. So each time we look at this, it's from the perspective of if we're going to add stations, it's going to slow the train down. It's going to be a longer trip. It won't be as desirable to people. Yet on the flip side, we want to make sure that in having a competitive travel time, we're also connecting with the points that provide the strong propensity for ridership and the opportunity to bring passengers on to the train, particularly those people who also have options in terms of the ways that they travel along the corridor. Next slide. We've talked to you previously on several occasions about the vehicle and the conversations about intercity versus other types of rolling stock or train equipment, as we refer to. This is the multiple unit that we have talked about previously, that there's been a lot of interest in because it does meet the goal of being a zero emissions vehicle. In this case, it's hydrogen. And the train that's in the upper part of the picture there is actually the vehicle that is currently being tested and certified to begin operation in San Bernardino as a part of the regular rail service that operates around the corridor that goes to Redlands from downtown San Bernardino. That the train is been given the name FLIRT. I will tell you that we have all tried to remember what FLIRT stands for. It's a little bit of an odd acronym that they came up for, but I want to say that it's a flexible, local, innovative regional transit is the term that they came up with. And this is actually equipment that has also been purchased by the state of California to begin putting into service in some different areas around the state once it's been certified and begins operation in San Bernardino. The thing about a multiple unit that's unique is that each end of the train is basically a cab. So it can go either direction without needing to turn around. And in the middle is where the motive units are, or that provide the energy to the operation of the train. And depending on the demand of a system or the length of the system, the train can be designed and modified in length to meet different characteristics. So the photo that's in the bottom is actually the same equipment that's being built by that manufacturer to be going into operation later in Dallas, Texas. Texans need some things, I guess, that are bigger, and so the train is quite a bit longer than what San Bernardino and others are planning to operate. But again, it's to meet their needs of having something, again, that's zero emissions and that provides flexibility in terms of the size of the train and the design of it for the operation that it's being put into. But I think in the next few weeks, actually here, we'll be hearing a lot about the certification of that train as it gets approved for operation in San Bernardino. Next slide. Again, just kind of an update on the vehicle itself and the conversations that we've had. It is with the intent of having level boarding, which is always ideal, particularly for people traveling with bikes or mobility devices. It also makes the boarding and alighting of the train quicker because people aren't needing to stop and pause for a step and whatnot. As we talked about, it is hydrogen and powered, and so it provides that zero emissions. And there are also a number of different amenities that can be accommodated on board depending on the trip length and the way that the service is going to be used. And so in this case, when you think about traveling along this corridor, it's the opportunity, for example, to have bikes on the train, if that's something that's desirable to people, so that if you don't want to leave it at a station, there's different things that we can do with the configuration of it to really meet the needs of the community and what people want as a part of that travel opportunity. Next slide. In terms of station design, and just as kind of a reminder before we step into the conversation about the alignments, these are the basic characteristics in terms of dimensions of the stations that will need to be necessary to accommodate this service. The length is typically generated by understanding the length of the equipment that would be using that. The width of the platform varies, whether it's the side or the center, in terms of certain characteristics that the platform also has to address for ADA. to ensure that there's a safe area adjacent to the edge of the platform that can be basically identified with truncated domes to keep people away from the edge, and yet ample space within the platform itself for people with mobility devices and other needs to be able to travel safely back and forth across the platform with others who are using it at the same time. Ultimately, the height of the platform is determined by the selection of the vehicle. Some of that is also dictated by other equipment that might share a corridor. And so that's a consideration we have to work to dovetail and make sure is consistent with what's in the other services in the state rail plan. And then finally is making sure that the stations provide shade and other basic safety and security features for the benefit and the safety of passengers as they're traveling the corridor. Next slide. Depending on the locations and what we know about the travel characteristics to and from those stations, as well as the adjacent use, the adjacent land use, and how people might be accessing them. These are some of the other elements that might be provided at any or all of the locations, depending again on what the community wants to have provided in terms of basic amenities, but also the things that might be appropriate given specific locations. So for example, a station that's in a downtown area that doesn't need to have its own parking and actually is an alternative for parking for people who are traveling into downtown may not have parking immediately adjacent to it. Another station that's a little further out where people are more inclined to drive to the station in order to get access to go into downtown or to travel further in the state may have parking that's provided for a part of it. And those are characteristics, again, that were partially generated by not only you, the community's input to the project, but also what we know about the propensity for the ridership to the various locations. Next slide. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Chris O'Gara, who's our lead engineer on the design, to provide you with an update on where we are in the baseline definition of this conceptual alignment that we are carrying forward in the conversation, not only about ridership, but ultimately about costs and other things associated with the opportunity for the development of the project. Chris?
Hey, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to talk a little bit about the conceptual alignment here. Let's go to next slide, Tiffany. Overall, the project objectives, we're looking at a concept here to address the community needs, look at, you know, being directed by what the commissioners are telling us, the RTC is directing us for the future of the region, both in the passenger rail service and in operations. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So throughout the project concept and timeline here, we've been working for quite a few months on a conceptual alignment. We've been looking at various different alternatives from Watsonville through West Santa Cruz. Generally, our overall criteria for looking at the alignment is identified on the screen. We're trying to stay within the existing rail corridor where feasible. We are looking to accommodate the already constructed and future rail trail project segments 8 through 12. In addition, we're accommodating the future rail trail project segment 11, phase 2, and trail segments 13 through 20 as part of this ZEPRT project. Throughout this design process, it's sort of an iterative process, but we're conducting a rail trail alternatives analysis and some of the locations throughout the corridor. We've been interested or considering potential right-of-way conflicts in the Capitola area, locations with potential operations conflicts in Watsonville along Walker Street and in Santa Cruz along Beach Street. and then locations with bridge and environmental impacts like the seascape area along Sumner, Hidden Beach, and Bush Gulch area. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so some of the areas that we're talking about for the rail trail alternatives analysis, here on the screen, we have the Watsonville Beach Street Bike Trail. So the original concept, I think, or a concept, is to study the rail trail inside the existing rail corridor. There's some constraints with operations due to the industry in that area and operating freight service for the existing sidings and the people in that location. So we've discussed with the city of Watsonville potential realignment of the trail along Beach Street, up Beach Street towards the downtown area, running along Beach Street to Rodriguez Street, potentially down towards the Pajaro River on the levee, and then across and back into the railroad right-of-way. In the Capitola area, we have a segment from 47th to around Thompson Street, the Jade Park area, with constrained right-of-way width and some encroachments. So we've looked at a couple different alternatives shown on the screen here. One out along Jade Park and along Brommer Street, back down to Thompson and into the railroad right-of-way, and then one along Nova Drive, and then across and kind of weaving through some of the streets back down to Thompson Avenue. And then at the Seascape area, the trail to the west of this image here is in the railroad right-of-way, but at Hidden Beach, we've looked at a possibility of constructing a trail bridge that allows the trail to leave the railroad right-of-way and head out to Sumner Avenue along the, I guess it would be the west curb face there, run south through the Seascape area, down to the end, and then back into the railroad right-of-way. Let's go to the next slide, please. So throughout this study as well, we're looking at areas that are susceptible to sea level rise, and we've identified a few different areas along the alignment, and they're noted here. The Pajaro River Rail Bridge, there is projects interested in raising the levees along the Pajaro River due to the flooding in Pajaro, and we're looking at options to raise the track over the Pajaro River, raise the rail bridge, and then the rail alignment along Walker Street. Harkins Slough area, we're looking at an option to potentially raise the track through Harkins Slough on a viaduct to reduce the impacts through the slough. La Selva and Manresa Bluffs, the area there is due to bluff erosion. We've considered an option to move the rail alignment slightly inland, considering the future bluff erosion. And then Capitola Bluffs, we're looking at options on how to keep the rail alignment through that corridor, considering bluff erosion. So the RTC will be conducting a separate climate resiliency study, and then through that study, a lot of these options will sort of shake out, and we'll come up with ways to address these areas. So let's go to the next slide, please. So along in the Watsonville area, as you're heading west over the Pajaro River along Walker Street, the existing condition has track running in the roadway. So there are some constraints with access in and out of the adjacent properties along Walker Street. Some safety concerns right now. there's the occasional freight service in the future with the ZEPRT project. There will be freight service, but there will also be a number of passenger trains coming through this area as well. So we've been working with the city of Watsonville to come up with a couple different alternatives through this location. One of the latest alternatives we've been looking at is potentially shifting the track alignment to the east edge, the east sort of curb side along Walker Street, in a sort of a new dedicated rail corridor, potentially having two-way roadway traffic along the west side of Walker Street. And then we've identified a couple different options for station locations in the area. One at the depot, the old depot location, and then one in the block between Beach Street and 2nd Avenue, I believe it is. One of the things to note about what we're calling Watsonville Station Option 1, the location at the depot, the platform needs to be on a tangent or a straight track segment. Right now, this image isn't showing that, but if we were to move forward with that option, we would have to do some more track realignment and to introduce a straight segment in that area for the platform. Let's go to the next slide, please. In Aptos, the Aptos Village area, we're looking, I guess there's an ongoing parallel project to ours called the Auxiliary Lane and Bus on Shoulder project for Highway 1. That project is proposing to replace the two rail bridges, one on the north and one on the south side of Aptos. And in doing so, in order to create the required vertical clearance from the bottom of the bridge structure to the roadway finish grade, it's requiring the track top of rail to be raised considerably at both of these locations. So what we're doing is we're looking at how to accommodate these Highway 1, the rail bridge replacements and the track raise. Because of them, we're looking at how to accommodate the profile and the alignment geometry through downtown Aptos and the adjacent neighboring areas. Some of the things we're looking at are the bridges on either side here of town, the roadway at Soquel, and the future Aptos station. Next slide, please. So as we head west at the New Brighton State Park area, our baseline alignment is considering our track alignment to stay within the existing rail corridor. We have identified what we're calling the Cabrillo station along New Brighton Road, I believe it is. And the station platform will be at grade, and we're considering a pedestrian connection across Highway 1 to the Cabrillo College. We've done some alternatives analysis here as well, considering a couple different alternatives to raise the track on an aerial viaduct, bringing the railroad closer to Highway 1, and moving the station out closer to Highway 1. There's some concerns with some environmental constraints and costs perhaps, but we're continuing to look at all options through this area. Next slide, please. And then as we get to Santa Cruz and the Beach Street and the Boardwalk area, we've identified 4 different alternatives based on 2 different horizontal alignments. and they're shown here on the screen. The red alignment has an aerial and an at-grade option attached to it, and the yellow alignment has an aerial and at-grade profile attached to that alignment. The red alignment considers the existing track alignment across the San Lorenzo River, with the track staying in the existing corridor under the log ride, and then shifting out in towards Beach Street in between the boardwalk and Beach Street, and then running down in front of the boardwalk until it gets past Cliff Street, where it then shifts to the coastal side adjacent to the existing bike lane, and then stays in that area, or I guess that location along that segment of Beach Street until it reaches Pacific Avenue. The alignment for alternatives 3 and 4, we're looking at adjusting the bearing of the bridge over San Lorenzo River and shifting the track approximately 20 feet to, I think it's the east of the column of the log ride out into Beach Street. And then the rail alignment will sort of hug that curb line trail location, existing trail location along Beach Street, where it runs west down towards Cliff, and then enters the same corridor that we have for alternatives 1 and 2, adjacent to the existing trail on the coastal side. I think that's about it for this one. I think we can go to the next slide, please. Next slide. And I think that's about it for the alignment alternative. I think I'll turn it back to Tiffany for next steps for Riley.
Yeah, and I think Riley,
Sure.
you're going to take this next slide.
I think we were wondering who, just making sure who's taking it. Yep. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mark. I know we've got several questions in the docket already, ready to go. So I'll make this quick. Go ahead and go to the next slide, and just briefly, over the next couple of months, we've got several opportunities for community engagement that we're planning, as well as stakeholder and partner agency briefings and meetings. We have tonight's informational community session. We also are planning and are about ready with the details for focused community meetings for several of the alignment considerations where we've done some additional work that we need to bring that work to the community for some input, such as the Santa Cruz Beach Street alignment in front of the boardwalk. So stay tuned for when those meeting dates and details get finalized. We'll push them out to the community to put on your schedules and calendars. And we'll be having additional informational community sessions as needed, likely 1 or 2 more in the spring and early summer timeframe. And in early summer, we'll have the draft concept report, as I mentioned earlier, and then the final concept report in the fall. So stay tuned for some dates that are coming out in the next several weeks for different ways to engage with the project. And I think that brings us to the end of the presentation for tonight, and we'll have some time for some Q&A. So Tiffany, I think you've got some teed up for us.
I do. And really quickly, before we jump back into the questions, just want to give everyone a reminder. We have received probably 25 to 30 questions in the Q&A box already. We have queued up, but we encourage you to continue to submit questions in that Q&A. We will get through as many as we can. As a reminder, on the Zoom taskbar, you can click on the Q&A and enter those there. And if you're in the conference room with the RTC staff. You can write those down and they will submit them for you. So with that, we do have a number queued up. So first of all, I'm going to pose two questions that are both related to the station locations and stops that I think can be answered together. So the questions are, is it true that stops and platforms could be added at later times if the public desires? And related to that, someone asked, during commute times, is it possible to run an express train, something, for example, with 1 to 2 stops between Watsonville and Santa Cruz, or does a single track system prevent that?
All right, that is a great question, Tiffany, from the community. Thank you for that. Mark, are you able to jump in and answer these questions?
Yeah, sure. So as we have had conversation, there's been interest, for example, in some of the stations that may not be a part of regular service because, for example, they serve a beach and the time that's there. Typically, this is something on a single line system that we would treat as what I will call an exception stop, wherein at certain times of the year or certain trips of the day, that train might be scheduled to stop at that location, but only during certain trips or say on the weekend or time when there's high demand to that location. Running an express train with fewer stops really is limited by how much of the system is in fact a double track versus a single track system. And even with a double track system, that can prevent some scheduling challenges as it relates to where trains would need to meet and pass each other. Again, it's those things aren't out of the question, but a lot of them have to do with the trade-off between the cost of the additional track and or if the track doesn't fit within the right-of-way, what the right-of-way needs may be to be able to accommodate a double track system versus a single track system, which admittedly a single track system can be more limiting in terms of the operations that you can provide for special locations or special services. None of those things are out of the question. The cost and how they dovetail with what would be a regularly scheduled service becomes the conversation.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Mark. And I'll add because I saw one of the other questions popping up in the chat in the Q&A that part of the question, as Mark mentioned, is where do we have our passing sidings and what is a single track versus a double track service provide? And the current right of way for the Santa Cruz branch rail line is obviously limited in many places, and the most opportunistic or best locations for some of these passing sidings don't necessarily match up well to where we have larger areas for right of way. So when we get further into preliminary engineering and final design, we're able to kind of do the cost benefit of providing for longer passing sidings that would allow for train meets to increase the service speed or versus the cost for doing that.
All right. Thank you, Riley and Mark. The next question from the community is also related to station locations. And the question asks, can you tell us more about where the Beach Street stop would be located? If it were at the Marine Sanctuary Center, it seems like it could serve a very similar group of riders as the old Santa Cruz Depot Park location, yet still allow the train to serve the west side.
Great, and another good question. And Mark, I'll have pitch it over to you as well.
So the location of the beach train, or the Beach Street station is one of the things that's still in flux as we work through some of the engineering detail that Chris referred to as the alignment, particularly in that area of Beach Street in front of the boardwalk and roughly from the river over to Pacific. There are a lot of details to still be refined in that area, and part of that is determining where the stop can be best accommodated while having the least interference with what happens with other travel along that roadway, not only auto travel, but bike and pedestrian travel. But that is one of the things as we work towards the next opportunities for public conversation at the end of April. We'll be more prepared to address specifically in terms of the location that best accommodates the needs while minimizing the conflicts with the other things on the street.
All right, thank you for responding, Mark. I will read out the next question. And again, I'm going to combine two similar questions related to ridership projections. So the first question asks, have you looked at streetlight data as part of your ridership projections? And the second question asks, in terms of ridership projections, has the fact that Santa Cruz has an aging population, some of who may age out of being able to drive or bike, been considered when estimating usage of the rail service? Riley, I will pass that off to you.
All right. Thank you, Tiffany. And Mark, I'll lean over to you again for this question.
Sure. So as I understood, the question was twofold. The first was about streetlight data, and the second was on aging demographics and the change of the community in terms of abilities to travel. And actually, the answer to those questions is kind of interrelated. So streetlight data tends to be data that's gathered from mobile devices. And so essentially, if you think that Big Brother isn't watching you every time you go somewhere and you take your cell phone with you, it's that data is being collected. And that data is able to tell some things about how you're traveling by the speed, the direction, the path that you follow. And that information gets aggregated then and provides a big data source to provide a lot of information about kind of where the areas of congestion are, the points from which there are a lot of people traveling back and forth, the ways that they're traveling. And it's a good, a pretty real-time source in terms of what you can look at and see how people were using transportation in Santa Cruz County or anywhere else at a certain point in time. What it doesn't do well is look at demographics from the standpoint of understanding the future of the population and also the attitudinal part of travel. And by attitudinal, what I mean is that the travel demand tools that we use that help us forecast ridership, what they're really trying to do is predict what human behavior is going to be. And they're doing that not only based on knowing the options that a community has and understanding how a community is traveling today, but also having some understanding as to how you might change your travel with other options that are available to you. And for example, that's information that often comes from the census data. The census has a whole module in what's called Journey to Work. That is a lot of information that many people complete as a part of the census that talks about how they travel, when they travel, what the determinants of their choice of travel are. And part of that also takes into account people's changing options during different cycles of life in terms of what their attitude is about the things that would influence their travel choice. It's that human behavior that comes from the attitudinal part that becomes critical as a part of this evaluation, because while streetlight and there are a lot of other sources that provide us with really good data on what is being used and how people are traveling today. What we're interested in understanding is what are the things that are important to you that would make you choose the way you travel in the future, or the way you would travel today if there was something to use that's not in place today. I cannot answer for you specifically whether it is streetlight data specifically that is providing some of the data that goes into the regional model. But there are other services like streetlight that also provide a lot of that collected data on the ways that people travel that does become a part of the baseline in terms of the model understanding how people are using the system today. And I hope that answered the question as succinctly as I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Before I read the next question, I do just want to share, it's 7:05 now. We know we advertised the end time for this meeting at 7:15. Because we do have so many questions and the presentation ran a little bit longer than we anticipated. Our RTC and HDR team is willing to stay on the line a little bit longer to respond to more questions. So just as a heads up, we will probably stay on for about 10 additional minutes to try to get through a few more questions for everyone on the line this evening. And with that, the next question I do have is asking, could it be an issue calling it an intercity rail project when it really isn't that type of service that we need? Fewer stops mean less convenience for travelers. Riley, I'll let you start that one.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing with the question, and Mark, I'll lean on you again for elaboration on the answer. But I think what it is an issue with regards to the funding source if we were in aligning with intercity rail service, that type of a service on the branch line. So when we do go through service planning, and Caltrans is about to kick off a Central Coast Corridor Service Development Plan, we will, in order to qualify for Federal Railroad Administration grant funding through the Corridor ID program, need to be providing a service that does align with what intercity rail goals and priorities are. So as we go through that process, that is the approach we're taking. If we weren't going to be providing strictly an intercity rail service, if we were providing a commuter rail service, and we weren't having the ability to interline on the Union Pacific Main Line, for instance, then ZEPRT would potentially not grant us the ability to move through the Corridor ID program. So our intent would be to align with the program requirements. Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's very well summarized, Riley. And I think this goes back to a conversation early in the presentation, as we've discussed before, also is the difference between the Federal Transit and the Federal Railroad Administration funding programs. And the Federal Railroad Administration program through the CID program provides a greater opportunity for funding of the costs associated with this project if it is in fact meeting the requirements of intercity service. And the trade-off for that is that when we look at what, for example, light rail or a more frequent service that's not qualifying as intercity service would cost in terms of implementation, the part of that cost that would be borne locally would be significantly higher, because that program under Federal Transit does not provide the same level of funding as a percent of a project as the CID program does. And so that's an important differentiation, because as we look at the cost of the program and how the program could be funded, being able to maximize both state and federal dollars with a lower amount of local dollars to get an investment has been an important part of this discussion.
Great, thank you, Mark. And Mark, do we have the ability at this point to clarify, as we've been working through the ridership forecast modeling, is there by going from a larger set of stations that are more frequent down to a smaller set of intercity rail type station locations, is there a significant expected drop in ridership because of that?
There could be, Riley, there could be some drop in ridership. I don't think that it is substantial when we look at the overall system, but we are still going to test that because what we're doing is with this list of initial stations, that's our starting point for the modeling to see how those stations respond. If there are stations that don't respond as we expect them to, one of the ways to test them is to add other stations in to see if there's a different location that people might be more responsive to. The other option at times is there are times where actually taking a station that doesn't perform well out of the list and reducing the number improves the ridership or has a nominal effect because of the fact that the increase in time, the decrease in time, the faster trip becomes an additional attractor for people in terms of the decision that they're going to make in their choice to travel that outweighs the few people that might have been inconvenienced by that location going away. That's part of the back and forth that will continue to be evaluated as we move forward with the development of the concept.
Great. That was a good additional information, Mark. Thank you. All right, back to you, Tiffany.
Sure. And I'm going to transition that answer over to a question asking for some clarification on the estimated travel time. And that question asks, is the 40 to 45-minute travel time estimate from Pajaro to Depot Park or Pajaro to Natural Bridges Station?
I believe the 45 minutes was to Natural Bridges in the evaluation that was done and developed. And again, that number is a little conservative right now because we are still fine-tuning. Part of that modeling effort is fine-tuning the operation of the train to make sure that we accommodate and have passing tracks in or sidings in the locations that are optimal for train meets as the trains go back and forth and have to pass each other along the line. So as we refine that, if we find places where we can adjust those train meets and have a passing track that best suits the schedule, there may still be the opportunity to take a couple of minutes off of that estimate. But right now, it's a conservative estimate based on what we know and the locations that we're looking at and refining those stations and the passing tracks.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
All right, and I'm going to transition us a little bit again. We have a few questions related to some of the specific conceptual alignment slides that Chris spoke to. So the first question that I'm going to ask from those asks, the new segment 18 trail in Watsonville, it's asking, does the new segment 18 trail in Watsonville have to be relocated to Beach Street?
And I can provide that, Mark. So the segment 18 rail trail project, I want to remind that the RTC Commission has had several conversations and discussions on advancing the segment 18 alignment out of the zero emission passenger rail and trail project to advance it sooner. So that work is ongoing, and the commission took action to program money to do that, and the scope of work is being developed to do a environmental analysis for segment 18. Through milestone 2 and 3 of this project, the ZEPRT project, we got feedback from the community that there was a lot of interest in a Beach Street alignment for segment 18, and a couple different options are on the table for that alignment, either wholly on Beach Street from the end of 17 all the way to the beginning of segment 19, or a couple options where the alignment goes along West Beach Street for a portion and then goes back onto the rail corridor before meeting segment 19. And part of the question is being discussed through the commissioner working groups. So there's going to be some work that the commissioners are doing to identify some of the opportunity and constraints in developing what that scope of work for segment 18 environmental document would look like. And back to you, Tiffany, unless Mark, you have something to add.
Well, I was just going to add one thing there, Riley, real quickly, because I think an important element of this that we also heard from the community, and we are also aware from a railroad operations perspective, is that section of the rail alignment that we're going to move off of to go to Beach Street, that is an area that goes through an industrial area, and there are a lot of switches that take or have the opportunity for freight switching in and out of private property along the railroad corridor there. And if you think about this from the perspective of being a bicyclist, if you're riding on a trail like that and you get to a point where the railroad is coming in at a fairly narrow angle to cross the trail, that's not a good situation as a bicyclist to cross because of the risk of you getting caught in the flange adjacent to the rail and what that means for your ride. So the way that has to be addressed for a safety perspective and for the interest of both the railroad as well as the bicyclist is for those crossings to be nearly as perpendicular as possible. What that means as a bicyclist is you end up with this zigzag trip because as you get from one crossing or one of those switches to the next, you're going to have to turn to cross it and then straighten out and continue along. And depending on what's happening with some of those crossings, they may also have to be gated depending on the amount of activity that occurs there in the future. Whether as a bicyclist or not, we appreciate it. The reality is that those railroad switches have been there for decades, and they have rights them also in terms of their operation. And so the way to minimize the risk for the bicyclist and give the bicyclist the best opportunity to travel through that area of the city is really to take the bicycle away from all those industrial switches that are in that area that create that conflict.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a key consideration that we've been discussing, as well as the key connections to some other locations and trail networks that would be provided better through potential different alignments than along the rail corridor.
All right, I will move on to our next question. And this question is related to the alignment in Santa Cruz and asks, what are the benefits of alignment alternatives 3 and 4 on Beach Street?
Okay, I'll have to refer to the map showing which the 3 and the 4 are.
And I can pull that up for everyone's benefit.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well.
So, great, Tiffany got it. So on the alignments 3 and 4 is bringing the rail alignment away from the log ride, and the current alignment goes across the San Lorenzo River and goes underneath the flume ride in that location. Yeah, there. There's some operational constraints of the alignment as it currently is, particularly with movements of the seaside companies, maintenance operations and maintenance vehicles through that area. And so bringing it away from that area reduces the number of conflicts through that area that we'd potentially have to design around or operational elements to accommodate those challenges. So those are the key things of alignments 3 and 4. There's both an accurate and an aerial version of that alignment that would take it around the flume ride a little bit to the north.
All right. Thank you, Riley. The next question, I'm going to move this over to a question related to the Aptos bridges. And the question asks, since those railroad bridges over the highway only need replacement because of the highway widening, wouldn't those bridges be paid for by the highway project?
That is correct. Yeah. So the ZEPRT project is not replacing the railroad bridges that go over Highway 1 in Aptos. However, the highway auxiliary lane and bus and shoulder project is replacing those bridges to allow for the project along the highway to carry on underneath them. But in doing the bridge replacement, the design team for the highway project is actually elevating those bridges to provide for meeting clearance requirements or newer design guidance and bridge designs than the older bridges that are currently there. So it's actually the profile changes to the alignment that have been raised, on the order of 1 to 2 feet. That is having kind of these knock-on effects for some of the bridges over Soquel Drive and Valencia and Aptos Creek, which is what our project team is working to adjust the conceptual alignment to. Back to
Thanks,
you.
Riley. Great. All right, and the next question asks, given what you've learned about the state rail plan and other regions' ongoing plans, what are some of the potential or likely destinations outside of Santa Cruz County that the train might serve in the future?
Okay. Mark, are you able to answer this one for us?
Well, so the benefit that this project has with the Union Pacific main line that passes through Pajaro is that main line could take you, gives you the ability to connect to things that take you all up and down the coast of California and the West Coast in general, right? At a minimum, when you look at the state rail plan and the connectivity, I think the key connection for this project, if you were to think of this as a one-seat ride, you get on the train in Santa Cruz or in Aptos, and you're not going to change trains again until you get to a certain destination. That point is most likely Gilroy. And in Gilroy, you're going to have the ability to, in the future, connect with services that go into the Bay Area, into San Francisco, into other Caltrain services, as well as the Amtrak service along the coast, and all of the things, including the connectivity to high-speed rail. And so that is really kind of, I'd say, the focal point as I look at it, of the benefit that you would have in that intercity connection that you would make coming out of Santa Cruz County and going to connect at that point. With Pajaro Station, if your trip terminated at Pajaro Station, depending on the type of service that was being operated on the main line, you might have Amtrak or other services in the future that you could connect to, or the Amtrak bus that would get you to Gilroy or to other locations to make those connections. But the beauty of this is intercity rail is that when all of those services are in place in the future and that connection is happening in Gilroy, is the ability to get on the train and have the one-seat ride to go make that connection.
Great, Mark. That was a good description. And I'll add that is some of the work that is going to be led by Caltrans over the next couple 18 months or so, is building out, fleshing out a lot of the service planning that just goes into what Mark's describing, how those efforts would work together and how the intercity rail service would enable users along the Central Coast Corridor to make those connections to other parts of the state via places like Pajaro, at Pajaro Station, or in Gilroy. Back to you, Tiffany.
All right, thanks, Riley. And I think this was probably our last question we have time for this evening. So the question I'm going to go to is related back to station locations. And the question asks, what if any stations will be between Aptos Village and Watsonville?
Okay, Mark, would you take this one?
If you could go back to the list.
I can.
I'm sorry. Let's go to the short list if we could. Right there. Okay. So as we mentioned earlier, this is the list where we are going to start with the data as it relates to what ridership looks like at each of these stations individually because of the propensity that we see and what the data supports in terms of the likelihood of the type of travel and the trips that people would be using from these locations. And the intent here is right now in this concept, and again, based on looking at the information that we have, is that this Pajaro would be the end of the line. The station location, as Chris explained, that we're looking at in Watsonville is basically in the area downtown close to where the historic Watsonville station is. And that could move a little bit, and that's conversation that's ongoing with the city as it relates to some of their plans and where that station platform is best accommodated. Under this list, the next station would be Aptos. Now, again, as we go through this evaluation, depending on what we see, as well as the feedback that we get from all of you, we may look at other locations. We may test those locations once we've developed this network and see whether or not another station provides benefit or not in the system. But based on the information that we have and what we're looking at in the data right now, this is the list of the high propensity stations where we're beginning that evaluation.
Great. And I
Okay.
think, Mark, would you talk a little bit just briefly about maybe seasonal or exception stations and what those might mean?
Well, again, the thought here is because of the input and the interest that we've had, is some of these other locations that are locations that may not generate much use on a regular basis. And again, that has a cost implication as well because it slows down the train, may detract other riders, but slowing down the train also increases the operating costs because we have to have more trains to maintain a certain schedule as a part of that service. We can have locations and may identify locations where it makes sense to have a platform that is only used at certain times of the year, certain times of the day, depending on what the demand is. And so that will be a follow-on part of the evaluation, this conversation, after we've identified the stations that make sense that meet the need of the intercity service and would generate the type of ridership necessary to allow the project to continue to move forward in that program.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And I will wrap up the Q&A there. I think Tiffany was going to do the same. But I'd like to invite everybody that's on the webinar today, as well as those who are viewing this at a later date, to take an opportunity to sign up on our mailing list or visit our project website to get additional information and also to sign up for our communications, to get our newsletters and e-blasts when they get sent out. You can also email us with questions at the ZEPRT@sccrtc.org email. And I'd like to also say that we've recorded all of the questions that were asked during the presentation. There were quite a few more than we were able to get to this evening. But we do have a list that we are putting together from the most recent information sessions that we hope to be able to put out a updated FAQ or some other sort of information to the community so that we can provide answers to some of these questions that we weren't able to get to today. And back to you, Tiffany.
Thank you, Riley. And with that, I think this concludes this meeting. We really appreciate everyone being here this evening and staying on with us a few extra minutes. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody the next time. Have a good evening.